Imagine a computer gives you the ability to make a mathematically flawless, perfect beat. Every single drum hit lands exactly where it should, down to the millisecond. Now imagine turning that computer off, playing the beat sloppy on purpose, and...
And accidentally creating the greatest groove in hip-hop history.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it completely defies logic. But that intentional defiance is really the engine behind some of the most important musical innovations of the last 30 years. When you stop trying to perfect a structure and, well, start trying to dismantle it entirely, you discover totally new ways to communicate sound.
Right. So if you're listening to this on headphones right now, I want you to imagine the pristine pop song you just heard suddenly fracturing into 100 jagged pieces. Welcome to today's deep dive. We have a single, just really fascinating piece of source material on the table today.
Yeah, it's a massive retrospective column from Monumental Movement Records, or MMR.
Titled Reconstruction of Experimental Abstract Hip Hop. And we are exploring how a group of absolute visionaries completely dismantled the traditional rules of hip hop to create an entirely new, just mind-bending sonic universe.
And what's crucial here is that the journey isn't just about music production. It's about a broader philosophical concept. Like, we are tracing how deconstructing a rigid, established structure can lead to paradigm-shifting innovation. It's an intellectual project just as much as it is an artistic one.
Yeah. So our mission for you today is to trace this evolution. We're going from the gritty underground clubs of 1990s New York all the way to the infinite digital landscapes of the 2020s. We are going to figure out how intentionally breaking the rules, making things messy, actually became a laboratory for the future of music.
But to understand the break, we first have to look at what was being broken, right?
Yeah.
By the late 1990s, New York hip-hop had solidified into a very, very defined architecture.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting right at that foundation. Traditional hip-hop had established rules. We had the classic boom-bap drum loops. For anyone unfamiliar, that's that heavy acoustic kick-snare, kick-snare pattern that really drives the rhythm.
Right, the head-nodding beat.
Exactly. And you usually had standard 16-bar verses where the rhymes landed neatly on the beat. But the MMR retrospective outlines two distinct movements that started swinging a sledgehammer at those rules: abstract hip-hop and experimental hip-hop. Can you draw the line between those two for us?
Sure, yeah. So abstract hip-hop, which really found its footing in the late 90s, was primarily a structural and linguistic shift. It deviated from that traditional boom-bap rhythm.
Okay.
The producers stripped away the conventional beats, and the MCs stopped trying to land their rhymes cleanly on the snare drum. Instead, they moved towards stream-of-consciousness lyrics.
Like just words flowing out.
Exactly, an unstructured torrent of words. They started utilizing highly abstract wordplay rather than straightforward linear storytelling.
So abstract is pulling away from the internal rules of the genre. What about experimental?
Experimental hip-hop is defined more by what it brings in from the outside. It intentionally deviates from the grammar of hip-hop by fusing it with peripheral, sometimes really abrasive genres. We're talking about dragging in electronic music, harsh industrial noise.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, free jazz and ambient soundscapes, just forcing these things to collide.
And the genesis of this whole collision really points back to a group called Company Flow, right?
That's right.
They formed in New York, featuring LP as a central producer and MC. And in 1997, they dropped an album called Fun Crusher Plus. Our source considers this the foundational text of the movement. But what made that specific album the blueprint? Because, people were making weird music before 1997.
Oh, definitely. But what set Fun Crusher Plus apart was that it operated as a dual-pronged attack. It wasn't just a collection of weird sounds for the sake of being weird. The production was actively antagonistic to the commercial, radio-friendly loops that were dominating the charts at the time.
Antagonistic how?
Well, LP was using jagged, unpolished samples and highly dissonant synthesizers. And crucially, they paired that abrasive sound with sharp, lyrical critiques of the music industry's very structure. So they were dismantling the sonic rules while simultaneously attacking the commercial rules of the genre.
Hold on, if they are just stacking dissonant synthesizers and jagged noise over the track and ruining the traditional beat, doesn't it just sound terrible? How does that actually function as music?
That's the core tension of the avant-garde. It challenges your definition of what terrible is. In Western music, we are so conditioned to resolution.
Right.
A chord builds tension, and then it resolves to something pleasing. What Company Flow did was sustain the tension without giving you the easy resolution. It forces the listener to find the rhythm in the dissonance. And right around that same time, another group in the New York underground, the Anti-Pop Consortium, pushed that tension even further.
The anti-pop consortium. They started injecting these fragmented rap styles with heavy synthetic electronic noise. But their most historic move wasn't just the sound, it was where they took it. They signed with Warp Records.
Yeah, and that contract was a massive cultural bridge. You have to remember, in the 1990s, genre walls were incredibly high.
Very siloed.
Exactly.
Hi.
Hip-hop lived in one ecosystem, and electronic music lived in another. Warp Records was an electronic label, famous for highly cerebral, glitchy dance music. By signing a hip-hop group, they basically proved these sounds could bleed into one another.
Which paved the way for Cannibal Ox's 2001 album, The Cold Vein, and the producer of that album, LP from Company Flow.
Right, he comes back in the picture. The Cold Vein is where that electronic bridge really solidifies into something monumentally heavy. LP introduced incredibly dense industrial textures directly into the hip-hop framework. It sounded like a dystopian city grinding its gears. It fundamentally changed the soil that future artists would grow out of.
Is this movement essentially the musical equivalent of Picasso's Cubism? Like taking a standard portrait, or in this case, a standard hip hop track, and fracturing it into jagged, asymmetrical pieces just to show us what it's really made of.
That's a really good analogy. If we look closely at Cubism, Pablo Picasso didn't just paint weird shapes. He broke down the rules of perspective to show multiple viewpoints simultaneously on a 2D plane.
Right.
When producers like LP brought industrial noise into a hip-hop track, the mechanism was similar. They were fundamentally altering the DNA of the genre by forcing the listener to experience the rhythm and the poetry from an entirely new, abrasive perspective.
The Company Flow and Cannibal Ox fractured the sounds and the words, but they were still fundamentally playing on a grid. To truly break the genre, the next generation realized they couldn't just change the instruments, they had to break time itself.
And this brings us from the 1990s into the 2000s, triggering a true rhythm revolution. And at the absolute center of this revolution is the legendary producer Jay Dilla. Specifically, our source highlights his 2006 album, Donuts.
To understand what Jay Dilla did, we have to talk about how a sequencer grid actually works. If you've ever looked at music production software, there's a literal grid on the screen. And there's a function called quantization.
The magic button.
Right. If you play a drum beat on your keyboard and your timing is a little off, you hit the quantize button and the computer magically snaps every single drum hit perfectly onto the grid. The kick drum hits exactly on the one every single time. It's mathematically flawless.
And up until Jay Dilla, that flawless grid was the industry standard. It made everything easy to mix, easy to dance to, easy to digest.
Yeah.
But Jay Dilla deliberately turned the quantization off. He utilized his MPC machine to tap out beats where the kick drum and the snare drum are intentionally misaligned from the sequencer's grid by just a few milliseconds.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Wait, so you're telling me that in a world where computers finally allowed humans to achieve mathematically perfect musical timing, playing sloppy on purpose became the new gold standard for groove?
It did. Because mathematical perfection has a fatal flaw in music. It can feel cold, rigid, and robotic. Humans inherently crave imperfection. When Jay Dilla played his drums unquantized, letting a snare hit a fraction of a second early, and then letting the bass line drag a half step behind the drums,
He created a whole new feel.
exactly. He created a concept we now call the drunk beat, or humanized swing.
It's like a marching band where the bass drummer is intentionally stepping a half second late. On paper, it shouldn't work. It sounds like a train wreck. But in practice, it gives the whole parade this incredible human swagger. He essentially gave the drum machine a pulse.
That human pulse was a direct rebellion against the rigid digital grids taking over music production. And it fundamentally changed the rhythm language of the entire genre. A whole wave of producers, artists like Samyam, Nexlage, and Mondran inherited this exact philosophy, building their entire sound around this off-kilter, drunk beat architecture.
Jay Dilla gave producers this new rhythmic DNA. He showed them how to manipulate time. But a simultaneous technological shift in how music was physically made gave them an entirely new canvas to paint on. We're talking about the massive leap from analog hardware to digital software.
Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, hip-hop production was dominated by physical machines, most notably the MPC 2000 sampler.
Let's break down how an MPC actually worked back then. It's a heavy metal box with 16 rubber pads. You take a physical vinyl record, sample a few seconds of audio into the machine's very limited internal memory, and chop that audio up across the rubber pads.
Right, you literally have to play the chops like a new instrument.
Exactly. Artists like Madlib and Jay Dilla were the masters of this chop culture, but you only had a couple of megabytes of memory to work with.
Yeah, you were physically constrained by the machine. But by the late 2000s, there was a rapid, widespread adoption of Audio's digital audio workstations, software programs like Ableton Live and Reason. Suddenly, producers aren't limited by the physical memory of a hardware sampler anymore.
They have infinite space.
Yes, they have software that allows for exponentially more complex layer configurations and infinite sample time.
It sounds like we went from making physical paper collages, where you literally have to cut up magazines with a pair of scissors and glue them to a single board, to having a digital Photoshop canvas.
Yeah,
In Photoshop, you have infinite translucent layers. You can stack 100 sounds, fade them into each other, and manipulate them without breaking a sweat.
that is exactly what happened. And with that digital canvas, producers realized they didn't have to just loop a 4-bar sample anymore. They could build entire, evolving sonic worlds. This technological liberation found its epicenter in the LA beat scene.
Oh, right. Low-end theory.
Yes, there was this legendary club event called Low End Theory, which started in 2006 at a venue called the Airliner in Los Angeles. The physical space was crucial. It had a massive sound system where producers could test these dense digital files and physically feel how the bass vibrated the room.
And the breakout star of that low-end theory incubator is a producer named Flying Lotus.
Flying Lotus is arguably one of the most important figures in this entire history. Remember Warp Records, the electronic label from the 90s?
Yeah, the ones who signed Anti-Pop Consortium.
Right. Well, they signed Flying Lotus in 2006. He took that infinite digital Photoshop canvas and he flooded it with analog warmth and jazz sensibilities.
On his milestone albums like Los Angeles in 2008 and Cosmogramma in 2010, the retrospective notes he was utilizing pulsating, non-linear rhythms and polyrhythms. For anyone who isn't a music theory nerd, what exactly is a polyrhythm in this context? Is that like playing a waltz and a military march at the exact same time?
That's a great way to visualize it. A polyrhythm is the simultaneous use of 2 or more conflicting rhythms. So you might have a percussion loop playing in a 44-time signature, while a synthesizer pulses in a 34-time signature right over the top of it.
That sounds chaotic.
It disorients the brain at first, yeah. But because of the digital tools Flying Lotus was using, he could weave these conflicting rhythms together into something that somehow still grooved. It was heavily inspired by experimental electronic acts like Autechre and Boards of Canada.
Flying Lotus then started his own label, Brainfeeder, to take this hyper-layered culture global. And what Brainfeeder really championed in the 2010s was a hyper-focus on texture.
Because the grid was broken and the memory limits were gone, it wasn't just about the beat anymore. It was about the tactile feel of the sound. Producers started treating audio like a physical material. Take a producer named Tees.
Okay.
He mixed micro noise, like the tiny crackles of a vinyl record, the rustle of leaves, into his samples to create what they call pinhole textures.
Or Clams Cassiner, who would take these beautiful ethereal vocal samples and digitally stretch them until they sounded like ambient ghosts hovering over the track.
We are so far away from the boom-bap drum loop at this point.
Which sets the stage for the total abstraction of the 2010s and 2020s. Armed with infinite digital tools and a total disregard for traditional rhythm, artists push the genre to its absolute limits. What happens when you abandon the core architecture of rap entirely?
You get a group like Shabazz Palaces. On their 2011 masterpiece, Black Up, they essentially threw the traditional 16-bar rap verse in the trash.
If they drop the drum machine and the standard verses, what is driving the momentum of the song?
They replaced it with West African percussion, heavy psychedelia, and ambient experimentation. And the rapping itself wasn't about landing forcefully on a snare drum. It was melodic, cryptic, and poetic. It floated over the instrumentation rather than locking into it. It completely redefined hip-hop abstraction for that decade.
And then you have an act like clipping. How do they fit into this era of abstraction?
Clipping takes the fusion of harsh noise and hip-hop to its logical extreme. But instead of the messy stream of consciousness of the 90s, they employ mathematical precision.
Right, their mechanics are wild. You'll have an entire track where there is no drum kit at all. The MC is rapping flawlessly at a breakneck speed over the sound of a shattering alarm clock.
Yeah.
Or like the rhythmic crunch of a piece of metal scraping against concrete.
They turn industrial field recordings into the rhythmic engine of the track. It's a demanding listen, but technically brilliant. And as we move into the 2020s, the streaming culture has completely liberated this experimentation. It's no longer confined to the underground of New York or the low-end theory club in Los Angeles. It has become a global, decentralized phenomenon.
We're seeing massive experimental scenes in Japan, Korea, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, and the sound is evolving again. The beats are becoming even more minimal, heavily ambient, leaning entirely into those field recording sounds recorded out in the real world, integrated directly into the hip-hop structure.
Yeah, it's constantly mutating.
Yeah. So what does this all mean? I want to pose a challenge to you listening right now. Think about the journey we just took. If you take away the classic boom bap beat, if you abandon the traditional 16-bar rhyming structure, if you replace the background instrumentation with literal harsh noise, micro glitches, and field recordings of a city street, at what point does it stop being hip-hop altogether?
It's the ultimate question of the avant-garde. And the conclusion drawn by the MMR retrospective is that experimental and abstract hip-hop isn't just a subgenre trying to fit into a category. It functions as a continuing intellectual project.
An intellectual project.
It was designed from the very beginning to dismantle structures. Rhythm, narrative, sampling culture, none of it was safe. Whether we are looking at Flying Lotus's multi-layered polyrhythms, Shabazz Palace's abstract poetry, Jay Dilla's non-linear drunk swing, or Clipping's alarm clock noise experiments, none of this broke hip-hop. It expanded its capacity to communicate.
By taking the genre to the absolute brink of destruction, they discovered the very tools that built its future.
Exactly. This ongoing, messy, rule-breaking project functions as the actual laboratory for the future of the music.
To quickly summarize the journey we've been on today, we started in the late 90s with Company Flow bringing a sledgehammer to the structural and commercial rules of New York rap. That fracturing paved the way for Jay Dilla in the 2000s to turn off the computer's perfect grid, introducing humanized swing and changing how we perceive time in music.
A total revolution.
From there, the digital revolution of DAWs allowed the Los Angeles beat scene to create infinite sonic collages. And that technological freedom brought us to the 2020s, where global artists use ambient noise and field recordings to push the absolute limits of what we can even call a song.
It is a phenomenal testament to the power of deconstruction.
And I want you to think about how this connects to your own life. The messiness and the rule-breaking we discussed today isn't just about making cool, weird music. It's a blueprint for how intentional disruption creates real innovation. Sometimes you have to break the perfect grid to find the magic.
I'd like to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. If the history of experimental hip-hop proves that breaking the rules until the errors become the new standard is the key to evolution, what rigid rules or perfect grids in your own industry or your own daily routines are just waiting to be dismantled and infused with your own humanized swing?
That is a brilliant question to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Go break some rules today, and we will catch you next time.